Hello and welcome to Two IPs and a Pod, a podcast on intellectual property from the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys. My name is Lee Davis, the Chief Executive of CIPA, and through this series of podcasts, I'm going to invite CIPA members and others from across the world of IP, including inventors, innovators, and creative people to share their stories with me. I am joined in this adventure by my regular co-host, CIPA Council member and Honorary Secretary, Gwilym Roberts. We are the Two IPs and a Pod. Fancy seeing you here, mate.
Good to see you as well. Last time I saw you, you were slumped against a sofa.
Do you know what? I was, because my wife was working quite late yesterday evening, I was relegated to the lounge. I think eldest daughter was playing piano. Youngest daughter was upstairs Netflixing or whatever they do. So I was relegated to the lounge. I can't sit on the sofa because I just get too comfortable and there's every danger I'm going to fall asleep. So I took the cushions off the sofa, put them on the floor, made myself as uncomfortable as I possibly could, and then suffered from the flaky Wi-Fi that you get when everyone's hammering digital in the house.
Lee's little nest.
Yeah, do you know what? I actually got quite comfy in there.
You did. You were slumped.
Hey, I've started my Christmas shopping, and I'm sorely tempted to get the Christmas decks out early and do the house up because we do that in kind of bigly style around here. How about you? You starting to feel a little bit festive?
I got me I started booking advent calendars because they go early. Struggling to find cat advent calendars.
Really? Oh, I'll have a look. See if I can get you one, mate.
Well, you know what I'm going to ask you now, Lee. Can you get tortoise advent calendars?
Oh, do you know what? I've never looked. I'm sure you must be able to. You must be able to get tortoise advent calendars. But in any case, if you could, this year, the calendar's all out of sync. Do you know, yesterday, I was watching the temperature yesterday and it got up to 15 degrees at about 11, 12 o'clock yesterday morning, which is insane. And we've had to put Albert back out in the garden because he was driving us around the bend yesterday. We've got this big glass conservatory thing where we cool him down in the winter as he's getting ready for hibernation. And yesterday he was just ramming into the glass at kind of a fairly hefty speed of knots for a tortoise, trying to escape. So we've had to stick him back out of the garden. So he's pre-hibernation cool down's gone totally out the window. It's insane.
I got an image actually of a tortoise advent calendar having 24 very large windows with a tortoise in each one. I think that would be a great way to go. Can we talk quickly about the exciting overnight news, Lee?
Go for it, mate. What is it? I don't know. I've not heard.
Yes, you do. This is a podcast, so obviously it'll be historical one day, but it'll go out quite soon. No, the exciting stuff about all these oral proceedings going to video conference at the EPO, I think that's really exciting. Yeah,
that's really good, isn't it? A couple of things. It levels the playing field, doesn't it? Because wherever you are, you can now represent before the EPO on the same basis. Doesn't matter whether you are based in the UK or if you're in Munich, you're going to be dialing in, which is brilliant news. Yeah. And also UK attorneys are just used to it, aren't they? They do so much video conferencing that they're just going to be brilliant at it.
Really excited. It removes what I'm thinking of as the distraction of proximity. It never really mattered where you were, but now you don't have to worry about it anymore. No, it really opens things up. Actually,
you always used to tell me you used to like to smell the fear of the opposition, though. Is that something?
No, that's what other people say. I don't believe in pheromones carrying huge weight in legal proceedings. So I think I don't have a lot of truck with that argument. We've talked about it with a couple of the judges as well, and I remember they were saying that they felt sometimes the video stuff was better, and I have to say it certainly works better for just about everybody, including the EPO examiners and opposition division members themselves, of course, because they can dial in too. So everyone's a winner. No, it's awesome. Very exciting.
And it does reinforce the EPO's standing as a sort of the international venue for filing, doesn't it? And how well does that fit in with our theme today when we're looking at the international market? It's great.
Is that a rhetorical question?
No, that's just me trying to establish a link, mate.
Very well indeed, Lee. Carry on. Good linking.
So today we're off to China. We've got 3 guests I'll introduce in a moment. Gwilym and I can see them on Zoom and they're looking at us in a state of total bemusement and confuddlement, not knowing what's going on, but they get used to it. Yeah, so we're going to explore China, not literally, obviously, because we're housebound. We're doing it I'm doing it from the comfort of my kind of lounge come study. And we've got great company. From the UK IPO, we've got Adam Williams, who's the Director of International Policy. We've got Conor Murray, who's the IP attaché at the British Embassy in Beijing. And we've also got CIPA Council's resident expert on all things IP in China, Daniel Chu. Welcome all. Adam, do you want to kick off and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Great to be here today. And I was just reflecting on your Christmas shopping. At one point yesterday, I had 3 delivery vans nose to tail outside the front of the house. I won't name check which company got there first, but needless to say, the Christmas shopping is in full swing at this end. Although based in Wales, we're now out of lockdown, so I should give a shout out for the free people of Wales this week. So anyway, so Adam Williams, nice to see you both. I know you both very well. Director of International Policy. So I sit on the board of the IPO under Chief Executive Tim Moss, who many of you know. In my kind of functional role, I'm responsible for kind of what it says on the tin, really, international policy, the international relations that the IPO has. Clearly, we all know that IP is hugely international, so it's really important that we have, a whole team actually looking at what we do in that space, ranging from at the top, and I'll talk a bit more later on, but from the sort of the top of multilateral space, World Intellectual Property Organization, World Trade Organization work, through to bilateral relations with various countries, China obviously included. And in the recent years, the trade agenda is huge as well. So I'm kind of the lead for all the IP elements of our trade negotiations, working with our colleagues in Department for International Trade, and then sort of European and EPO European institutions as well. So quite a wide portfolio, but happy to expand on that a bit as we go through the chat.
Fabulous. And whilst we've got you on the podcast, we might take advantage of the fact that you're here to touch a little bit on the wider international trade questions at the start, maybe, if that's okay.
Sure, that's great.
Conor, who are you and what do you do?
Hi Lee, hi Gwilym. My name's Conor Murray. I'm the IP attaché at the British Embassy out here in China. So I've been in China for over 3.5 years now, but I've only been doing the IP attaché role for the last 4 months. So I started back in June. So I've got a fairly good understanding of China. I mean, I'd even say 3.5 years is obviously not enough for that, but IP is fairly new to me. I used to work on it a little bit in the past in my previous role, because I covered trade policy previously. So obviously IP is linked to that. But the sort of technical detail and stuff I've been sort of getting into, and the team both in the UK and in China have been getting me out and about, meeting people, trying to learn as much as possible, which has been really good. It's great to be here as well, and hopefully maybe I might learn something from this podcast as well, as much as you guys sort of just having a conversation. For me, it might actually be quite educational.
We can't promise anything like that. I was new to the world of IP 9.5 years ago, and I'm still learning. So good luck with your learning curve. It'll be it'll be steep but never ending, I think is the way it goes. And last but by no means least, Daniel, care to explain who you are and what you do and why you are our expert on all things IP in China?
Sure. Well, thanks for having us. I'm a chartered and European patent attorney. So I'm a partner at Full IP Service.
You can name them. Go on, name them. Never mind.
Can I? At Haseltine Lake Kempner. So yeah, we're a full IP service private practice firm. I've been in the profession for just over 16 years. So ever since I've joined the profession, I've been actively involved in IP related activities in China, not just business development, but also engaging with local governments. I remembered visiting the British Embassy in Beijing when Conor, your predecessor, was based there. I think it was in 2012. Yes. And one of the things I remember was he mentioned about asking UK companies to register their IP in China. And after that visit, I was determined to bring that message back to UK companies. And since then, I have been actively organizing roundtable discussions and events in the UK to promote the importance of protecting IP in China. As Lee mentioned, I'm also a council member of CIPA. I lead the China working group of the CIPA International Liaison Committee. And proud to join the profession. I did an electrical engineering degree and PhD in mobile communication in technologies relating to 2.5G. So we've come a long way since then.
We've actually doubled the G's.
We've doubled the G's.
we have, yes. So it's my age, which makes me feel rather old. Okay. Thanks for having me again. I'm delighted.
Thanks. And it's great to have experts on the pod, and also you, Conor, of course. So I thought, get used to it. There's lots of abuse as we go through the podcast. It's normally Gwilym that's getting it in the air, but I feel generous with it today.
Happy to share it.
General question, first of all, if we can kick off with that, and that's I guess it's mainly aimed at Adam, but by all means, come in if you feel you've got something to add to it. And that's the international landscape post-Brexit before we start to look specifically at China. So what's big on the UK IPO's agenda in terms of everything that's going to happen post-Brexit, Adam?
Thanks, Lee. So I kind of touched on it a bit in my introduction. So I think, perhaps starting at the kind of, I say at the top in the broadest sense and working down. So, WIPO's got a new DG, which, will be an interesting approach. I think a very capable person, Darren Tang, and we look forward to his stewardship of taking over from Francis Gurry. But, WIPO's got quite a lot to look at. It needs to think about the changing world. Everybody talks about AI. In some ways, AI is probably almost the old thing, because I'm sure there's stuff coming down the track that we don't yet know about that will change things even more. But I think they need to get to grips with that. And obviously the UK has a strong focus on how we use AI, both in a practical sense and also the sort of the policy or kind of legislative questions that it brings that a lot of your listeners will know about. So I think there's a really important focus there to make sure WIPO does that, but also serves its purpose for businesses and for the IP sort of landscape. So make sure that it's the patent systems, PCT, and all those things work efficiently and well, and do those things. So focus there on that basis. I think bilaterally, continue to work with the countries we're working with. Obviously, post-Brexit, in one sense, has changed a lot. In another sense, hasn't changed a huge amount, perhaps in the IP world. So, continue to work with the countries that we've continued to work with to develop their systems, to share best practice, to encourage them to take part in the international landscape. COVID, wouldn't be a podcast in 2020 without mentioning that. But, I think, there are some international questions about, particularly around pharmaceuticals and access to medicines, and the sort of that whole debate about whether IP is a blocker to that access. So making sure that the UK's response, clearly we don't think that's the case. We think there are ways to manage that, and IP plays an important part in developing those vaccines. But making sure that international debate is broad and the UK view is put into that. And then sorry, there's lots of priorities. This is going to be a long answer, I'm afraid. And then traders, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, obviously a new, not as new, I think, as people think. There's a lot of talk about sort of UK hasn't had any trade negotiators. Well, that's true to a certain extent, but we've been negotiating as part of a bloc of 27, 28 in Europe, and with our counterparts, but internally in Europe as well. So, but the dynamic is different. Some of the processes are different. So learning those new processes and making sure that the IP chapters, which are part of every modern trade agreement, are the best we can make them. And then finally, Europe and its institutions, less so EPO, because as you know, that's not really affected post-Brexit. So obviously continue relationship with them and continue to work with them very strongly, but working out what our new relationship with the IP elements of our EU partner countries, particularly the particularly industrialized ones, and also of course on the trademark side, the EU IPO, which continues to be, we will need to continue to have a relationship, not an operational one, but a policy and best practice relationship. So bit of a run through there, but quite a few priorities. Who needs sleep, eh?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I was going to say about the work that you guys have been doing in relation to the various bilateral free trade agreements and keeping a steely eye on the IP clauses. Out of interest, very quickly, obviously this is mostly about China, but how does that kind of dynamic work within the government? Who are you talking to make sure they're listening?
So, clearly, Department for International Trade, again, the names on the tin are huge. Like some of the teams, literally on, talking to them 5 times a day about stuff. They have an IP team managing the trade relationship there as well, and they absolutely symbiotic with us in terms of the much deeper understanding of the IP system and the nuances there. But across the piece, obviously, DEFRA in the geographical indication space is an important part. So, and they lead on that area. So, but again, there's the touch points between trademarks and GIs that we need to manage and make sure that they make sense. Treasury, of course, are interested. There's IP is of huge value to the UK, so they want to make sure that the decisions being made, are right from an IP perspective, but also right from an economic and UK PLC perspective. Foreign Office as well, they're leading on some of or the Foreign Office, should I say, the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, because they've merged with DFID now, but they lead on some of the smaller rollover trade agreements. So where there's already been a EU trade agreement. So a huge kind of pot of people there, but actually DIT have been very good at bringing together sort of cross-Whitehall groupings to discuss those. So it's not a scattergun approach. There are sort of kind of set points in which we can discuss these issues. And obviously ministers clearly get to take the ultimate decisions.
Thank you.
I think we should probably say that we've been really grateful to the help and support the IPO has given us. I know it can't directly intervene in some of this stuff, but it's been useful to speak to people and to canvass views, particularly particularly in the work that we've been doing about the importance of the UK remaining in the EPC. And we now see the government's made a firm and strong commitment to that. So that's been a really good piece of work for CIPA to be involved in. And as I say, I know we couldn't ask you to intervene directly for us at all, Adam, but big thanks to the IPO for just being there in the background to help us get our thoughts together.
No, and just on that point, I mean, I kind of answered Gwilym to the kind of the cross-Whitehall, the government sort of pot of people, but absolutely stakeholders are hugely important to this. And, you as associations are able to bring together that kind of, those huge numbers of individual practices and interests and bring that into one voice, but equally your colleagues in the trademark associations and also industry associations. So absolutely, we'd need to talk to those guys as well.
Right, let's see if we can wake Conor and Daniel up. So we're here to talk about China. We'll start off with the IP attaché network in general. What's it all about? There will be people listening to this who don't know we've got IP attachés, won't know where they're based, and won't know what their gig is. So help us understand.
Shall I just kick off from the very general overview? You've heard.
We're not going to be able to stop you, Adam, are we? So
no, I know exactly. No, I'll do it very general, and I'll very quickly hand over to Conor. But so just across the world, we have attachés based in Sao Paulo in Brazil, DC in the US. We've got 2 attachés based in Geneva, covering the WIPO and the institutions in Geneva. An attaché in Delhi, covering India. 2 down in Singapore, but actually covering the ASEAN region. Singapore's kind of the base, and then a team in China. So they're out there to provide support to businesses, to work with, the other governments on their legislation, and also help us with our trade, understanding the sort of the needs of the trade team. So I'll just say that as an intro, and then I've nicely left China to the end, so Conor can seamlessly segue into that.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think, to be honest, you've covered it quite well there in terms of the rough what we do. I mean, we have part of the role and the team. So I've got a team of 3 people out here in China that work with me. So I've got 2 in Beijing, 1 in Shanghai. So one sort of key focus is obviously engaging with government and engaging with the Chinese IP authorities when there are new laws, new regulations, trying to improve practices, share best practice from the UK, but also actually increasingly learning from what China's doing as well. They have some new sort of cutting edge industries, and they're genuinely world leaders in some areas as well. So actually learning from what they're doing in terms of regulatory IP around those industries is quite interesting. We then do a lot of business support. So UK businesses that either are thinking of coming to China, we'll speak to them about some of the risks and some of the opportunities. But also obviously businesses that are based in China that face any opportunities, we can offer direct support. So as an office, there's all kinds of different support that we can do, writing letters on behalf of the companies, etc., raising cases with government when we think that someone's been treated particularly unfairly. But then actually a big part of the role is kind of facing back to the UK, and it's kind of more around sort of the educational piece. And like I was saying at the beginning, I've not worked on IP very long, but before I sort of started, my impression was IP in China. Previously, I used to work on market access with China, which is trying to open up Chinese markets. So I was like, oh, must be a sucker for punishment for wanting to go and do IP in China next, But actually, things are drastically improving here. And I think over the years, if I was asking my predecessor, Tom Duke, who actually still works at the embassy, when he started versus where we are now over the space of roughly 10 years, I think we've seen really big changes. And I think it's actually going back to the UK, talking to people about those changes, saying it is actually becoming easier and easier to protect your rights in China, and kind of doing a bit of myth busting, I think is actually quite a big part of the role as well. But yeah, so I think that's kind of a rough overview of what we do, but it will vary a little bit geography to geography.
Can I ask Daniel? Daniel, do you have much of a relationship with the attaché network, particularly in China?
Yeah, as I said earlier, the first time I visited was back in 2012. So I engaged with Tom Duke on different matters. So, for example, I think we had some UK companies having trouble with IP issues in China, and we approached Tom at that time to sort of, rather than, because we have an understanding that there are different routes to explore in China, such as like the administrative and judicial routes. And we wanted to know on the ground what exactly can we do, whether engaging with local governments or local network would help the clients or the UK company resolve the IP problem in a more practical manner. So for my personal experience, I found that the sort of interaction very, very helpful.
Cheers, Daniel. So open question to any of you: why is China so important to the UK?
It goes without saying, it's the second largest economy in the world. There's huge commercial and consumer buying power here in China. Then there's huge trade opportunities as well. From an IP perspective, IP is conducive to trade. it's obviously of massive importance for that reason. But I think increasingly China is going up the sort of value chain, I guess, and that it's looking to become an innovator. It's not sort of being this sort of, as it was before, the factory of the world. I guess it is slowly, it wants to be the sort of inventor rather than just the manufacturer, which I think is really interesting as well. In that, move this transition from, in the past having IP infringement cases, lots of issues, to now one where it's actually in China's interest to better protect IP. It's all part of its sort of development goals. And I think that makes it, regardless of the trade part, it's actually just a really interesting time to be looking at what China's doing, how it's changing its laws, and ultimately, given it's the second biggest economy in the world, anything that China does is going to have repercussions elsewhere. So it's also, quite interesting to see what they're doing, and are they actually looking to export their model of IP as such, in the way that, we obviously in the past, we've worked with plenty of countries in terms of, developing their IP systems as well. So it'd be interesting to see whether China also decides to do that one day, but maybe too soon to tell on that one just yet.
I kind of, if I could just come in, I mean, I'd obviously echo that. I mean, it's, China, even just in volumes of patents, a small percentage, a huge percentage are domestic patents. But if you look at those numbers, and then if that increases slightly into export patents, then actually their influence on the IP, totally take Conor's point about the economy and the wider piece, but even on the IP system, their influence is huge and could potentially swamp some of the smaller IP offices if necessary, if the patent applications ramp up massively. So even by small digit percentages. So it's really important they're part of the international sort of conversation about the detail of IP as much as the kind of the wider kind of economic piece as well, because they're hugely influential, and we're seeing that more and more, I think. So that's really important from a pure kind of IP perspective.
Yeah, I just want to add on to what Conor and Adam just said. I think I recall that at the first China International Import Expo in 2018, which our previous CIPA president Stephen Jones and I attended and had the honor to be invited as keynote speakers at one of the IP events. President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote message at the opening ceremony, and one of the things he said was, and I quote, China's imported goods and services are estimated to exceed $30 trillion and $10 trillion respectively in the next 15 years. So that triggered headlines in the local media, and the message was China is no longer the factory of the world, and China is ready to buy and trade with the rest of the world. So your business in the UK, whether you're in the UK, US, Japan, or Southeast Asia, you would say China matters. And for me, rather than saying why we are focusing on China, I think we could say that we should not ignore China. And from a patent attorney profession perspective, China is moving. It's not just moving fast; it's speeding towards really innovation-based economy. And as we all know, it's very much supported and encouraged by the government by way of incentivizing its people and companies financially to file patents. So, patent attorneys, we work with innovative companies, we provide services to these companies, and naturally this matters to us.
I know I'm supposed to be mostly listening and asking questions, Lee, but I was at school in Hong Kong, now Hong Kong, China, from 1978 until, I can't remember, 1987, I think it was. And it's amazing remembering how China seemed then. From across the board, it was just this kind of dark place that you didn't go to, you didn't hear very much about, and it was all quite mysterious. You got lots of low-grade, cheap goods and utterly beautiful goods, I should say. Actually, I think we've still got things like old rosewood chests knocking around in my parents' house and things like that. But at the time, it was just closed, and to watch the transition. And I've been out on some of the CIPA visits with Adam. I think we were out at least once. Anyway, it's just an astonishing place. I mean, this isn't a place for geopolitics, and I don't know geopolitics, but it does seem to me, and Conor, you might have a picture of this from inside China, actually. China's making a bit of a grab to take, shall we say, some ground that maybe the US has lost in terms of, positioning itself globally as one of the most kind of an authoritative. And it was a climate change announcement that caught my eye when they said, oh, by the way, we're going to be carbon neutral, whatever it is, by 2060. I thought that was a definite global message. Is that something you're hearing within China?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was particularly maybe the previous administration. I'm still not entirely clear what's happening there in the US election right now, but assuming that a Biden presidency does come in, I think the sort of Trump administration did leave a little bit of a vacuum there, and I think people in the US would say that themselves, and that they weren't maybe stepping up into the same fora that the Obama administration was. And I think China definitely capitalized on that in terms of wanting to portray itself as a global leader and stepping up into that vacuum. And I think, the carbon neutrality announcement is a clear example of that. And they signed the Paris Agreement back in 2015 as well. They've stepped up to the plate. I mean, in other areas, they're looking as well to maintain sort of leadership. In WTO as well, they're getting increasingly active and increasingly defending sort of multilateralism and the WTO, and when they see it as being attacked by the protectionism of the US and stuff. So there's some of this rhetoric that you would never have expected to see 10 years ago, I think. But in the IP space, I'm not as sure. I think with WIPO, I mean, China obviously put themselves forwards to be a DG. Well, I think they put their candidate forwards to be a DG at WIPO. So I think they obviously see it as a space that they also want to step in. Like Adam said, they have a massive influence here. Like, they are the largest filer at WIPO by, for the first time this year they overtook the US. So I think increasingly their influence on the international stage is going to increase for everywhere. Yeah.
I think just from my perspective, I think what's really interesting in 2020 is, it's the only economy that's going to grow. I saw something, I think it was in The Economist this week about okay, it's not huge, but plus 2 or 4%, whereas everybody else is going down 8 to 10%. And I think also the supply chain shift this year will be interesting as well. This onboarding of supply chains, as our supply chains have been disrupted this year, and companies are bringing them a bit closer to home or bifurcating them so they've got alternative routes. I'm not an international trade economist, but I just think that'll be an interesting shift, how that affects China, and whether actually, as traditionally a lot of goods were made in China, but now whether China sort of almost onboards some of its supply chains and actually or starts trying to invest in overseas countries to give it a supply chain in the market it's trying to sell into, if you see what I mean, rather than transshipping, and how that affects, obviously that then bleeds into the IP space as well in terms of activity, Chinese company activity, acquisitions and those sorts of things, and the IP that's involved in those. I think the jury's out at the moment, but I think something to watch for the next sort of 5 years.
I was going to ask, actually, over recent years, the conversation's always been around the volume of filing that China is involved in. But I think recently we've seen that change, and we've seen different strategies be adopted by the Chinese in terms of investment and procurement. Daniel, do you see that from an attorney perspective?
Yes, definitely. There's been, and China is still filing. Can I say aggressively? But definitely we've seen a shift in that. Take for example Xiaomi. Xiaomi was, I think, established in 2010. It's a very relatively young company in China. I guess you can call it the Apple of China. I don't know. And I think when they realized that increasingly there's competition in the domestic market, they were looking to move overseas. They're looking at overseas market. However, they have a relatively young IP portfolio. So what they did was, they look at procurement opportunities. One of the, I think, biggest deal they did in 2016 was they bought 1,500 patents from Microsoft. I can't remember the exact figure. I think it's in the region of $50 million US, that deal. So that was quite significant. If you look back, look into their portfolio there, you see that there are patents that were owned by US corporations such as Intel Corporation and Broadcom. So that deals have been going on. Same for the case of Alibaba, for example. So biggest IPO in 2014. Prior to that, you could see that Alibaba was filing lots of patent applications in China. And then 2015, there's a massive decline in filing in China. So they shifted the market. They see the importance of going overseas. So that has been a change, and I think we will start to see increasing procurement licensing opportunities with Chinese companies.
In terms of the UK building on developing its relationship with China from an IP perspective, what are the challenges, Adam, Conor?
I mean, Conor will have some of the detail. I mean, I think we have a really good relationship. I think we're coming up to, I think it's nearly 25 years of formal cooperation with China this year. So it was our first attaché market that we put an attaché into, I say about 10 years ago. So actually, we're starting from a good foot. I think the challenges will be there. I think in terms of where our views differ and where there are some clear some wider geopolitics in play. So I think how we fit into the wider narratives that UK government has across the piece outside of IP, but of course these things are never sit alone in a government space. So I think making sure that we continue to be an important partner for China on IP, which I think we are, but we make sure that we don't lose that in sort of the wider noise, if you want to call it that, and also being really clear about where we're coming from in some of these discussions and being able to articulate them, as I say, in a sort of a multilateral sense. But as Conor said, I think that's becoming easier now with China's stance in some of those multilateral markets. And and I think the final thing is, we are one of the biggest. I think it's the fifth biggest trading partner for us, about 6% of trade. So obviously we are a big partner for them, but we're not the biggest, clearly, and making sure that we kind of punch above our weight, I guess. So that's my kind of like helicopter view of it. But I'm sure Conor will have a bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. I think like you said, protecting the sort of IP relationship as such from the wider sort of bilateral things, which obviously we would normally do that in the way the UK operates overseas is normally done in that way. But I mean, China, it's very much, it takes a sort of almost it's all or nothing sort of approach. So going through a bit of a bumpy period, but we have actually, even this year, we've still been able to have some really sort of good exchanges with China. Like we recently just had our exchange on copyright, and we plan to continue doing these exchanges in other areas of IP as well. So despite everything that's going on, I think there is a clear indicator that and as we were mentioning before, as China looks to become more of an innovator, it increasingly it has an interest in learning from the UK, and I mean that's why we have I think you guys will know about this, but for years we've had a patent examination exchange with China, and I think that's very much sort of it's in both our interests, and that we obviously get to share our best practice, and hopefully it's adopted, which makes it easier for UK companies to then operate in China. But also obviously they very much want to learn from how we regulate innovation. But more widely, I think the biggest problem that I think we have in terms of sort of working with China is just basically trying to sort of understand what the sort of objective is. We see all of these new laws that come out, and so many different parties that influence these laws. So I mean, obviously we might comment on them, and the US comments on them, and other bodies. I mean, I say us, British companies, British associations comment on them. But then obviously there's a huge amount of Chinese companies that are also involved in this. I mean, Daniel, you mentioned like Alibaba, and I think we're seeing that some of these regulations at the minute, especially over the last couple of weeks, have really, you can see the tension that there is between sort of what China wants to do, or the Chinese government wants to do, and what sort of the vested interests, I guess, of those giants that have basically been Alibaba, Tencent, and others that have kind of just been left to grow as best as possible when everything was thrown at them. And now maybe getting into a stage where actually, do they might want to sort of rein that back a bit, or not have too much of too many monopolies. And so, we're really, it can be quite a struggle sometimes to fully understand what the objective is and what China actually wants to achieve and how we feed into that. And I think, we've been talking about this a bit as well in terms of, China's investment overseas, but also, their new sort of domestic policies. Like if you've heard this dual circulation policy that's been floated around recently that, Xi and Premier Lee have been speaking about, where it's effectively about creating a market, a domestic market that is strong enough to support, the Chinese economy, and not relying too heavily on external players. And I think a lot of this is aimed particularly at sort of Trump administration tactics with China. And so it's trying to understand that, on the one hand, looking to improve IP, looking to collaborate with us and make things easier for foreign companies to come into China. But on the other hand, also talking about basically creating an environment that ultimately is better for domestic companies and make it in strengthening domestic players. So yeah, it can make your head spin a little bit, to be honest, but we try our best to sort of understand what's happening.
Question to Daniel, if I can, and I'm going to bring Gwilym in here as well, because he's actually a patent attorney, and I don't use him as a patent attorney often enough. So from a Gwilym, Daniel, from a private practice perspective, is the UK profession a natural partner of choice for Chinese business and industry?
I think most of foreign companies, I think to this day, I can say still prefers British representation when it comes to handling European patent applications or patent applications at the IPO. And I think for me is, as a profession, I just want to mention, actually, this is to follow up on Conor's and Adam's point, is there are lots of Chinese companies still growing, and they're growing fast, growing second tier, third tier cities. A lot of attention, even as a profession, we've been focusing a lot on companies in main cities like Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Beijing. I think we shouldn't forget companies in those second and third tier cities who aren't as patent savvy as companies in those big cities. And as I said earlier, the Chinese government is very supportive, and they want to educate and help these companies, and they have established regional IP administrative offices and information center to support these companies. So I think for us, the challenge is, well, knowing the existence of these offices that's been established, understanding what those companies need to know and what they want to know about securing and enforcing IP in the UK, and providing those relevant information and services. I feel that this is something which the UK IPO, the UK attaché, and CIPA can work closely together to try to engage with the Chinese government, to try to engage with the local government to bring that into effect.
I mean, I'd add to that excellent analysis, actually, that we should be really well aligned. Conor, you mentioned the UK punching above its weight, and I think certainly as far as services go, we absolutely do. I've had, as I say, quite a few fantastic visits out to China. I have to say, I'm dying to go back. I love the hospitality, and I love almost all the food. Am I allowed to mention my best ever menu mistranslation now? Just to
go on.
For a sec.
When can I ever stop you?
No, it was in a restaurant in Shanghai. It's fantastic. It seemed like a family restaurant, really, really lovely. But the menu had been, I don't know how they translated it, but one of the dishes was called deep fried eel period. And I've never worked out what that was. But going back to the point, so I missed China for lots of reasons, partly because it was just exciting. But I never felt that the UK profession has really got the amount of work. And I think, Daniel, you touched on the fact that we're seen as the IPO, not the EPO. And I think in terms of future cooperation, can I just re-mention that hearings? I think it's really interesting that the EPO is also obviously massively important, and we're fantastic there. The fact that it's basically just shifted to the cloud kind of means that again, that distraction of proximity's got, and that could be quite an important selling point, I think, to China, to say, everyone's in the same boat. You can use anyone you like in Europe, and we know our stuff. We are the service economy. And my visits, and I think quite a few UK professional visits, tailed off over the last few years to China, because in the end you just couldn't justify going out and not getting the return. So it's something to be good to revisit. Actually, you're really good.
Conor, you touched on some of the developments in IP law in China. Are you able to give us a potted summary of what's been happening in terms of IP law and what might happen in the future?
Well, yeah. Well, again, a big question. I think, the area I used to work on, we'd maybe get an updated sort of foreign investment law or something like that. We'd maybe get, one a year. Since I've started the role 4 months ago, I think on average, we're getting 2 or 3 new sort of pieces of regulation every week. So there's a huge amount that's changing, across everything, trademarks, copyright. I think today they've just adopted a new copyright law, and the new patent law was adopted about 2 weeks ago. So, it's massively sort of changing. A lot of this is sort of linked to the sort of US-China tensions, where China basically put together an action plan in terms of meeting the requirements of the US-China Phase 1 trade deal. But I think it would be naive to kind of look at all of what's happening in China right now and think that it's all about just meeting US sort of demands. It's actually a lot more about basically what China wants to do and how it wants to bring its economy and improve domestic innovation. I think that's actually the key sort of objective, not actually meeting US requirements. Some of them actually fall hand in hand, so they can do both at once, but a lot of the focus is actually on improving sort of the Chinese business environment for Chinese companies. In terms of some of the recent stuff that we've seen, I think the new patent law is really interesting. It introduces some things that, even though the US had pushed for it, we weren't entirely sure whether China would adopt them. So it introduces a patent linkage system, for instance, which I think quite a few people, even though China had spoken about it maybe 3 years ago, I think we were, there was quite a fair bit of surprise at how quickly China brought that back onto the table and now adopted it, even though it doesn't come into force until June next year. It's also got some sort of, it increases or introduces partial design protection as well, which China's never had. So that's also quite a big step. And there's a bunch of other sort of positive and sort of other negative or more negative parts of this as well, including around the patent linkage system, which, to be frank, we don't actually, the text in the law doesn't really explain exactly how it's going to work in practice. And so it's kind of makes you wonder if it's just in there symbolically or whether they will actually do something with it. But that remains to be seen. And so I think looking ahead, all of these things are happening on paper. They're happening. The laws are changing, the regulations are changing, and that's great. But in China, we always say, the proof is in the pudding, and ultimately it's all about how these laws are actually implemented. And I think that's what's going to be the really big sort of challenge for China next year is, they've adopted these new laws, this huge amount that's changed in regulation, but it's actually going to be about telling people, particularly, I think like Daniel was saying, sort of outside of Beijing and Shanghai, where actually the IP administrations are fairly strong, going into smaller tier cities, I don't know, in some places quite impoverished locations, getting sort of IP or local officials there to understand actually what's changed and why and how, if a foreign company or even a Chinese company is invested in that area or registering their IP, how they're actually meant to implement the new laws and what that means. I think that's going to be an enormous sort of challenge going forward. So it'll be a lot to watch, and sort of, at least me and my team, that's going to be sort of the name of the game really, is looking at how they're implementing these new laws and whether it's actually really making a difference or not.
Gwilym touched on his desire to get back to China at some point in the real world, I think, not via Zoom or anything like that.
Yeah.
Are you starting to think at the UK IPO about how we might regenerate that relationship once we get through COVID, whatever get through COVID looks like? Are we looking at trade missions in the future? Are there things that CIPA can involve itself in?
So I suppose the short answer is yes. I mean, I think what we've really found is having boots on the ground. So Conor and his team in China, but all the other ones I've mentioned, is really a sort of force multiplier for us, particularly while we can't do visits from UK. So having, our relationships have been maintained really well across the world where we've got attachés, and we might look to expand them slightly in some other places, because I think it's really shown that for us. Slight digression, but that's quite important. But yeah, I mean, in terms of we're having a virtual meeting with CNIPA, the China Patent Office, this week, which would normally, in a couple of weeks' time, which would have been a sort of a physical visit, alternating between UK and China. And whilst that will be good, it will not be any substitute for kind of the week-long interactions. And that's kind of, I think, actually the last time myself and Gwilym were in Beijing was part of the previous iteration of that. So absolutely, I don't think it's any substitute, but I think we should also look to leverage the kind of the new world order and the new technologies to try and do a bit of a hybrid approach to get the most out of it.
So what I'm hearing, what I've heard on this podcast, is that China is continuing to grow in importance, particularly to the UK, and particularly to the UK profession, that the future is rosy, that we have plans to regenerate our relationship with China, and that our members and others should be looking forwards to that. So big thanks to the three of you for joining us. But in the same way that I started this with a kind of global perspective, and I guess I'm kind of looking at Adam again. And Adam, you can refuse to answer the question, and we can edit this whole chunk out. So don't be in fear of what I'm about to say next. We all know, sat in this virtual room as we are, that it's most likely that there'll be a change of US administration in January. Are there any thoughts currently about what that might bring from an IP perspective to the UK?
I think it's too early to say, but we are absolutely looking at it. As I said, we've got Attaché in DC, and she's doing a think piece for us to see what that means. I think managing IP and a couple of others have already kind of put some thoughts out on what a Biden administration's focus might be, and whether it moves a bit away from big tech and the sort of Google, California, and a bit more towards perhaps pharma and sort of, the global perspective. And, obviously Obamacare was a big piece, was the vice president when Biden was vice president. So too early to say, but definitely on the agenda to think about these things. And as I say, other people are already starting to comment as well. So watch this space.
Not nicely straight bat. Well done, Adam. So Adam, Conor, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to Gwilym as well, because he got involved in this one a bit more than he normally does. So cheers, mate. And we'll see you all on the next pod. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.